Well, it is my deep, deep honor to introduce Angela Davis and Mariah Parker in conversation. Angela Davis is an iconic activist, scholar, and author who, over the past 5 decades, has been at the forefront of our nation's quest for social justice. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Mariah Parker is a queer hip-hop artist, organizer, and PhD candidate in linguistics at the University of Georgia. She was also elected county commissioner at age 26 as part of the new wave of young women of color entering politics nationwide. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Angela Y. Davis and Mariah Parker. Yay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So when we first started thinking about doing a virtual youth summit, having you two come on together in conversation was one of the first things we thought about. And we wanted to do something unique. We wanted to have you each ask each other questions. But before I hand it off to you and exit the screen, I want to start off a question to both of you. So intentionally, we made this youth summit intergenerational. So it's a variety of our speakers and artists who build across generations. And I want to ask you, Angela first, and then Mariah, you can bounce off. What is the importance of opening the conversation to involve several generations?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Amalia, for inviting me to participate in this youth summit organized by SpeakOut. And congratulations, Mariah. It's really wonderful to meet you. And I look forward to having this conversation with you. So since I've been asked about the importance of intergenerationality, I think I would say that communicating across generations helps us to create the kind of continuity in social justice struggles that allows younger generations to learn from past strategies and agendas in order to create new ones that are both anchored in those past conceptualizations, but go beyond them. I think that this kind of continuity assures that that those unfulfilled promises of the past can become agendas, more robust agendas for the future. So young people allow us to better understand what we ourselves were attempting, but not yet fully understanding where we were going. So I would say that younger generations always chart the new route, always show us the path forward. And older generations should be supportive, should learn from the work of younger generations, and hopefully we'll move in the same direction together.
Beautiful said. Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and think it's so important for us as young organizers to learn from the histories of struggle that have come before us, the struggles that they faced with regards to strategy, with regards to the demands they made and the ways they were building coalition. And so that we can take some of the things that didn't work, the things that did, and use that to inform the way that we move forward. And so to learn from that past is so critical for ensuring that we are strategizing and organizing in ways that fulfill those promises of old, but also learn from the tactics of old in making sure our future is different.
Thank you so much. I'll let you all take it from here.
All right. It's such a pleasure to be here with you tonight, Dr. Davis. I've been a longtime student of your work, and I know that you've been involved in many movements for social justice since you were a teenager, and I wonder what makes you hopeful about the current moment.
Well, I think I'm more hopeful now than I've been in a long time, because I don't think I really expected to experience this moment. those of us who've been talking about abolition and the future, often have pointed out that, well, we probably won't see this in our lifetime. We won't see abolition become a popular way of giving expression to radical political goals. But of course, at the same time, many of us have said that we have to act as if it were possible to achieve these goals. And I think that today we're so much closer than I could have imagined in the past. But of course, that means that that we have to take advantage of this current conjuncture. We have to do the work that is required in order to anchor our struggles in a more radical way, so that we can begin building toward an end to racism and heteropatriarchy and the ways in which the entire planet has been damaged by capitalism.
Yeah, I feel very hopeful in this current moment too. When I became a student of abolition in 2018, right after I became a county commissioner, it was a very fringe idea, one that, a viewpoint that was not held by many of my constituents yet. And so the fact that it's become mainstreamed in just the last couple months alone gives me a lot of hope for what we can accomplish in the months and years ahead. You've often said that your life was saved by a mass movement that was organized all over the world. Can you tell us about witnessing this collective power in action and how it resonates today? Particularly, I was hoping if you could speak about the power of international solidarity, what it looks like and what it can accomplish.
Well, I grew to political maturity during a period when international solidarity was very powerfully emphasized. As a matter of fact, the Black movement in the US was inspired very much by what was happening in Africa, by what was happening in Latin America. There were struggles for African liberation all over the continent. There was the Cuban Revolution. And so I think we felt a part of what appeared at that time to be a planetary impulse moving us in the direction of perhaps an end to racial capitalism. And when I was in jail, charged with a number of capital crimes that could have at one point taken me directly into the gas chamber, the state of California abolished the death penalty while I was still in jail. But it was the international movement that saved my life. People organized all over the country, of course, but also all over the world. I was a member of the Communist Party, and there were Communist parties in virtually every country in the world. There were also other formations, and I'm persuaded that had it not been for all of the organizing, the demonstrations, the petitions, the telephone calls and telegrams, that's what we did in those days. We didn't have, the new technologies of communication, that I might very well still be in one of the women's prisons in California. So, and let me say that I'll never forget that James Baldwin, whom I had met earlier because of my involvement in LA SNCC, James Baldwin wrote this powerful open letter to me, in which he said that people had to recognize that if they came for me in the morning, they would be coming for the rest at night. If they come for you in the morning, they will be coming for us at night. And that letter circulated all over the world and helped to draw people into that movement. And as a matter of fact, I always point out that people know my name today, not so much because of the things that I've done as an individual, but precisely because of that movement. So I see myself as representing all of the people who were involved in that movement, because we need that kind of solidarity today. And we need solidarity, but we also need more than solidarity, especially during this period of increased migration, climate injustice, racist state violence in many countries. We can truly learn from the struggles of people in other countries. And I think that even those of us who consider ourselves radical activists in the US are sometimes affected by American exceptionalism. And we sometimes believe that because we live in what is considered to be the most powerful country in the world, we have the answer. And therefore we don't approach other peoples and other movements with a kind of humility that would allow us to learn important lessons for our struggles here. So I would like to say that we really need to look toward Brazil, especially considering the fact that the most powerful social movement in Brazil is the Black women's movement, and the whole history of Black women in leadership, especially in the religious practices, African traditional religious practices in Brazil. And of course, we need to learn from Palestine. And we need to be aware of the fact that people are struggling against racist state violence in places like France. So yeah, I think this is the moment where we have to really emphasize our connections with people beyond the borders of this particular nation state. So since we're talking about developing powerful movements, and you are a part of a group of young women of color who have run for office or are running for office. And I should tell you that I was really impressed in Brazil when I went in the aftermath of the assassination of Marielle Franco, who was an elected official in Rio, and at the same time an activist in Black and queer movements and movements against militarization. But in the aftermath of her assassination, large numbers of Black women ran for office, and many of them won. As a matter of fact, the first Black trans woman was elected to Parliament in Sao Paulo, Erica Malanguinho. And so I'd like you to talk about your experience of running for office.
Yeah. And so I never saw myself as a person that would hold political power when I was growing up or in my early adulthood. But I started, getting involved in community organizing through hip hop, bringing people together around music, and which I think we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. But through that experience of being a hip hop promoter, I heard so many stories of struggle, of people who in their music were talking about turning to selling drugs because they were tired of making $7.25 an hour working at Dairy Queen. Stories of folks being incarcerated for no, fault of their own, having hung out on a corner and been profiled as being part of a gang. And saw that cultural change. We need cultural shifts, yes. And the barriers we broke down in terms of racial divide through art was transformational for the community. But we needed public policy change in order to change the material conditions that were informing the stories that people told in their music. And so I was faced with a scenario in which the man who had represented my district in Athens had run unopposed for 25 years, during which period we saw our educational system fall farther and farther behind, our infrastructure begin to crumble, gentrification sweeping Black families out of our neighborhoods. And I saw the need to step up. It's easy enough to sit around on the sidelines and hope that someone else will jump into action and do something. But I saw in this moment that I may lack the political expertise or lack the connections or not have the money. I might have a checkered past with run-ins with the police and struggles with substance abuse myself, in my history, but someone had to do something, and that someone had to be me. I couldn't wait around for someone else. It had to be me, because it's so important that people have options. People see not only what their government should do for them, but changing their imaginations of what they deserve and what is possible through local public policy. And so putting that option on the ballot, just to, create robust conversations in our communities through debates and through canvassing and through talking to people on the phone about what public policy could do to change their lives. And so I decided to run for office 3 months before the election. And we got out there, with this coalition of working class, service industry folks, young people, students, musicians, and started going out into the community and listening to people, listening to what things that people wanted to see, and offering our policy prescriptions for how we could transform the material conditions in their lives. And through those 3 months of thousands of conversations, thousands of doors knocked, hundreds of miles walked, holes in our sneakers by the end of it all, I was able to win by 13 votes. And I never forget, and tell this story frequently, that I stood out in the rain in the parking lot of the elementary school, which was the main voting location in my district. And I talked to numerous people in the parking lot that day who pulled up and rolled down their car windows and said, I heard there's an election today. Who should I vote for? So particularly at the local level, our votes are so important, are so critical, and not just voting, but also contending for and taking power so that the activists in the streets have an ally behind the rail, at the table, in those seats of power, to materialize those policy demands. And so that's the work that I've been doing ever since.
So are you connected with other young people who are considering running for office or who have run for office? Because sometimes the electoral arena is a bit of a controversial site for radical activists. Yeah. So what do you say to people to encourage them to do what you've done?
Yeah, I would say that our lived experiences are the expertise we need to make bold, transformative public policy. We've lived the failures of bad public policy with it, whether it's access to reproductive health care, access to mental health care, access to higher education, and the barriers that are currently in place around these areas. We've lived that. We know that intimately. We know how necessary change is, how needed and critical it is. And so I think leveraging that lived expertise in coalition building, sharing those stories with our community so they see that we are people just like them, and that they will have, through our, candidacies, representation that reflects the experiences that they themselves have had. I think that is so important for young people to really own their histories, own their stories, and share their stories. And with that, anyone can win. It's just a matter of putting yourself out there, particularly when no one else shows up, or the folks who are showing up aren't doing a good enough job. You can't wait around, like I said, for someone else to do the work. It has to be you if you see that need is necessary.
So were you running with a particular party?
No, so my race was nonpartisan. Yeah. So I didn't have a party affiliation. Yeah.
Okay. And so how do you see the connection between what you're doing at the local level and what's happening nationally and internationally?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that we can do at the local level to make an impact on things like our global climate crisis with regards to divesting from fossil fuels and investing in clean and renewable energy here at the local level with helping folks access things like solar panels, to the way we construct new buildings, divesting from the police. I think the calls to defund the police are really most needed. And you have so much leverage to make change at that local level. Because you can actually, you might not be able to get your congressman on the phone, but you can get a cup of coffee with your city council person and talk through the need for us to divest from policing and invest in true harm reduction for our community and the resources our communities need to thrive. And so, a lot of national issues ultimately trickle down into what we can do locally, and local politics is where I believe we can make a lot of change.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay.
So, when faced with so many issues in society, Dr. Davis, from racism to economic justice to climate change, violence against women and trans people, how do we go about combating them all? I know, as young folks, sometimes it's a little overwhelming for us to think about how do we combat these various forms of oppression. So what would you say to young folks who might be experiencing that overwhelm?
Well, I think that the whole notion of intersectionality of struggles is helpful here. Because many of us in the past who have spoken out against the single issue strategies. I can remember many years ago when I was in jail and I was asked to write a statement for a big reproductive rights rally that was happening in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it was focused very specifically on abortion rights. Abortion rights are, as we know, extremely important. But in my statement, I was trying to make the connection between the failure to achieve abortion rights and at the same time, the imposition of sterilization on Indigenous women and Black women in prison. And to argue that reproductive rights required an attention to racism. They didn't read my statement because they thought that I had violated the rules of working on the issue of abortion. So we don't want to do that. But at the same time, as you say, we know that we can't do everything. But what we can do is work with consciousness of all of the interconnected struggles, so that when we're involved in campaigns against gender violence, it's important to recognize that we cannot fail to see that Black trans women are the target of all kinds of violences, from state violence to stranger violence, individual violence, intimate violence, and therefore that has to be included within our way of thinking about what it means to challenge gender violence. Climate change. How can we not devote some energy to preventing the ravages of the planet, to prevent climate change? Because, of course, if we do manage to win struggles against racism, against homophobia, misogyny, etc., but our planet is dead as a result of the ways in which the corporate world has so exploited the planet, then of course it will have made no sense at all. Our victories will be meaningless. So I think that it really is about a way of conceptualizing what it is we're doing. Sometimes we have to work very intensely on a very specific issue. And we do that, but we do that against the backdrop of understanding the intersectionality of struggles, or what Dr. King called the indivisibility of justice.
I couldn't agree more. I think so much in my own organizing about, using a framework of abolition to argue for achieving our basic rights to housing, to healthcare, to education, but thinking about how that impacts my queer brothers and sisters, how that impacts Black and brown youth, how that impacts our immigrant brothers and sisters, how that impacts folks of very gendered identities. And so bringing that into our issue focus, whether it's around access to public transportation, whether it's around climate change, whether it's around police violence, having that intersectional understanding of who is impacted by these issues is a way for us to maintain a clear view of our goals while making our struggles inclusive to all and making sure we're uplifting the least among us.
Mm-hmm. Well, since you now hold public office in the state of Georgia, and I know that you've been doing a great deal of work challenging the structural violence of policing. So I'd actually like to know about your experiences, particularly in light of calls to defund the police and abolish the police.
Yeah. I mean, I think that in honor of Breonna, because they shot her in her sleep, and in honor of Eric Garner, his carotid in his sleep, and in honor of Rayshard, because he'll never push his daughter on a swing again because he was in his car and fell asleep, and in honor of Andres Guardado, martyred in the street, we got to organize and agitate and start to believe that it might take another winter, another autumn, another sleep, another spring, but no matter how long it takes, we will abolish the police. And earlier this year,
oh, thank you.
Thank you. Earlier this year, I put forward something called the 50-10 plan, which is a plan to, over 10 years, transition 50% of our armed officer positions to positions of social work, restorative justice mediation, and compassionate crisis intervention as a way of diversifying the array of crisis responses that are in our toolkit as a city to deal with anything from a man standing on a train bridge about to take his life who needs to talk to a mental health expert and not an armed officer, to a homeless individual breaking into cars to steal change out of a cup holder who, might need the benefit of a social worker to connect them to services, or for a couple that's in an argument at their home and might need someone to come and mediate that argument, or someone who's having a loud house party and needs someone from code enforcement to come ask them to turn the music down rather than have an armed officer respond. And so we're continuing to fight for that. Through educating my colleagues on the commission about abolition as a framework for just supporting communities, strengthening the fabric of communities so that we reduce harm in them and make sure that everyone has the rights they're entitled to. And so we continue to fight. We continue to organize on various platforms, from marching in the street to mass political education, as I've done through music and as I continue to do at rallies. And I am hopeful that, in the coming months, we can implement a compassionate crisis response team with akin to the Cahoots model in Eugene, Oregon, to address if people need a wellness check, if someone's panhandling, if someone's loitering, these minor issues that really just speak to underlying problems in our community that truly are what need fixing. We can have a more diverse array of responses to those kinds of situations. And then investing money in community gardens for our neighborhoods, in youth development opportunities, strengthening workplace democracy, and fighting for living wage for folks as harm reduction measures. And so that's a little bit of the work that, I'm engaged in here locally. What are your views on defunding or abolishing the police?
Well, I've learned a great deal from being a part of the abolition movement for a few decades now. I can remember when the Attica Rebellion took place in 1971, and prisoners at Attica called for abolition of the prison system. It was the first time seriously began to think about the possibility of a world without prisons and the critiques that people like George Jackson and other prisoners were developing. I think it's so important to recall that so many of these ideas came from people who were in prison, who are incarcerated. And one of the most important things I think I've learned from being a part of the abolition movement is that the struggle is a very broad struggle. It's not only directed at particular institutions, but it's an ideological struggle as well. It calls upon us to recognize how we have internalized notions of retribution, how our impulse always is first to call the police. Something happens, and before we reflect on how we might address this issue in ways that do not involve the intervention of armed human beings, the impulse is to let the police handle it. And also in our relations with each other, even some of us who call for abolition of the prison system, abolition of the police, we have internalized those ideological impulses, and we do the policing ourselves, and we do the retributive reaction ourselves. And so I've learned about the holistic character of abolition. We can't simply focus on specific institutions. We have to focus on ourselves, on our relationships, on our emotions, on our culture. Yeah, I could talk for a long time.
Oh yeah, me too. It's a subject of which I'm really passionate about. And when you speak about the way we internalize this retributive thinking, it recalls for me earlier this summer when I was facing some death threats for my activism and for my cause to defund and abolish the police. And people, pressured me into pressing charges, contacting the police to let them know that these threats had been made against my life. But I urged people instead to think about the institutions that created those men that threatened my life, the churches that they went to, the schools they attended, their families, and how we can remake these institutions such that we are making a new kind of person through them, producing a new kind of culture through them where this kind of thing doesn't happen. If they had been thrown into jail, it's likely they may have grown bitter and doubled down on their racism and their misogyny. They may have been connected with other white supremacists to fortify their thinking, but instead thinking about the institutions that created them and how we remake those institutions as part of our abolitionist work. Scholarship around organizing, or scholarship and organizing, rather, around prison abolition dates back decades, but the idea of police abolition feels very new to many people. Can you speak to the history of police abolition? And I wonder what you think about if there can be a world with police but without prisons, and or if both systems need to go entirely.
Well, that's a really interesting question. And in my experience, police abolition has always been linked to prison abolition, either implicitly or explicitly. Strategies designed to resolve issues of harm without resorting to the police have been linked to prison abolition strategies from its origin during the contemporary period. And I think it might be interesting for people to look at the statement that was issued, I think it was 2001, a joint statement by Critical Resistance and Insight, which, as many people know, is an organization of women of color against violence. And that statement very specifically called for developing creative ways to begin to address issues of gender violence without relying on the police. activists have created police-free zones. So I think that now we are confronted with real possibilities of beginning to shrink the power of the police. The whole notion of police abolition has come to the fore. And I mean, it's interesting because I don't think we would have ever imagined it happening this way. And sometimes moments arrive, these historical conjunctures that are produced, in this case, of course, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the recognition of structural violence, structural racism, rather, within the healthcare system, and the confluence of that with the lynching of the police lynching of George Floyd and the police murder of Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and so forth and so on, created this moment of emergency. And I can remember seeing the slogan "Defund the Police," which happened exactly when it should have happened, because it meant that we were able to enact a kind of rupture with the past strategies that have always been focused only on prosecuting the individual police officer, find the bad apples and remove them, reform the police, just as calls have for the reforming of the prison system. As a matter of fact, reform. The refrain of reform has accompanied the development of both institutions from their very foundation. As a matter of fact, I like to think of reform as the glue that has made these structures of state violence more permanent and more solid. It's really exciting now.
It's a very exciting moment, and I really love your metaphor of reform as the glue that holds it together. And I strongly recommend people read Prison by Any Other Name by Victoria Law and Maya Shenwar, where they talk about the dangerous reforms that have become common sense to many legislators and in our common discourse, and how abolitionist alternatives for us to pursue.
Yeah, their book is really wonderful.
Really good read.
I totally agree. Everyone should read that.
Yeah,
because it's not about looking for ways to make the system more humane or introducing home arrest and how all of those alternatives that have been represented as alternatives to incarceration, but they extend the net of carcerality even further.
Yes, exactly.
So let's see, what do we talk about next?
So let's talk a little bit about progress. What is progress to you? Our definition in this country is often about economic progress and not about the well-being of people or the planet. What does progress look like for different groups, and what does meaningful social justice progress over the next few years look like to you?
And that's a really complicated question, because I think I would argue that on the one hand, we've made very little progress. We're still addressing issues that should have been addressed in the immediate aftermath of slavery.
It feels like we're slipping backwards in some terms as well.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, we've accomplished so much. And I like to look at the realm of consciousness, of collective consciousness for progress. I'm trained in philosophy, and And one of the insights that I constantly refer to is by a German philosopher named Georg Friedrich Hegel.
Mm-hmm.
And he argued that progress in the consciousness of freedom, that is what history is. He says history is progress in the consciousness of freedom. And I think if one looks at Black struggles, of course, one can also look at struggles of indigenous and Latinx communities. But if one specifically looks at the struggles of Black people in this part of the world, in this hemisphere, it is remarkable that over the last 5 decades, and we can say that the first slave revolt took place in 1526 in this country, and to think that over 5 decades, 5 centuries rather, practically, this collective impulse to struggle for freedom has continued to motivate generation after generation after generation. And that's actually really remarkable. One of the things I like to add when I think about this long stretch of history is that not only have Black people struggled against the worst possible manifestations of racist violence, and not only have they experienced the most imaginable hardships, but in the process have created beauty and pleasure. And I like the way that you incorporate music in the ways in which you are thinking about our organizing, because I think that that is a measure of progress. And over the decades and over the centuries, we have become increasingly conscious of the of more holistic definitions of freedom. Our notions of freedom have become larger and broader. Back in the 60s, if there had been a conversation about pronouns and the need to acknowledge pronouns, people would have said, well, what does that have to do with anything? But of course, the ways in which the trans movement has called upon us to think deeply about the nature of normalcy. And the normal is the realm of ideology. Mm-hmm. A friend of mine has said that when you look at what appears to be the most normal expression, there you find the role of ideology. And so I'm excited about the ways in which our notions of freedom have become so much more expansive. In the beginning, in the Black movement, it was about freedom for the Black man, literally for the Black man. And now, of course, with our various notions of the relationality of issues and struggles and intersectionality, we are much more equipped, I think, to move forward in a progressive direction. And so one of the things I think now is actually it's good that we didn't win the revolution when we thought we were going to win it. Because had we won at that point, we would have institutionalized some of the worst, forms of injustice, because we were not conscious of the importance of the centrality of gender and sexuality and the movements of the disabled people. And so I think that we are making progress in the consciousness of freedom. And that's beautiful, I think.
Yeah, agreed.
So, yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit about, I know that you're a student and you're,
True,
what
yeah.
year are you?
So I am a PhD student at the University of Georgia.
Right. But what year are you in?
Oh, I'm in my final year.
Oh, congratulations. Wonderful. Wonderful. And I think I want to ask you a question about students and the role of campuses. And it seems that as if students have always been in the forefront of movements for change. The civil rights movement would not have become what it was without the huge numbers of students who went down to the South to participate with people who were involved in the voting rights movement and other struggles in the South. And as someone who has actually lived on campuses virtually all of my life, and not literally lived, but that is where the work that I have done has been located. And there have been moments when I was a bit despondent because it appeared as if students were not as conscious, politically conscious, as I thought they should have been. But then, of course, times have changed, and there is this really powerful consciousness around issues, structural racism. It's amazing the ways in which terms that we've been using for so long in rather marginal settings have become a part of the mainstream discourse. But maybe you can talk a little bit about what you see happening on campuses and the role that you see students playing now.
Yeah, one of my mentors and advisors here at the University of Georgia, Dr. Bettina Love, one of the preeminent scholars of hip hop education. I love Dr. Love.
I know her work. Yeah, she's amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, she's an advisor of mine. And in our class on abolitionist teaching the other day, she said it's for people 30 and older to break down the systems of old, and for people 30 and younger to build what is coming ahead. And so I think that utilizing our sites of our campuses and our college communities as sites of organizing has a long and storied history across the country, and continuing in that tradition by taking leadership in campaigns, not just around reforms within our institutions themselves, but within the community, to ally ourselves with local struggles, because folks in the community will remember who it was that helped them get that street light on their street, or who provisioned them with that mutual aid they needed to keep their lights on or keep bread on the cupboard shelves. And so getting involved in those local struggles to learn from the lived experiences of those that keep our communities running, to build those organizing skills that we'll use lifelong, to turn our moments of scholarship, the histories that we have to write and the group projects we have to do, to harness those moments for seeing how we can educate ourselves in ways that forward the movement. So, using our studies in ways that help propel the movement forward. But it's ultimately upon us, the students, and I think, through our campus communities, through our organizing, through our affinity groups as colleagues in the same university, to be a part of deciding what the future looks like. And so it's it's a form of organizing. I think it's a long history, but one that needs to be carried forward today. I want to ask you about music. So as you know, I'm a hip hop artist.
Before we move on.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
May I just make a comment about an issue that I've discovered being a professor and having contact with many students over the years. These institutions that we attend in order to get an education often instill in us a sense of superiority. Mm-hmm. And I've had many conversations with young people who are so excited about what they're learning, but they're also afraid that they're losing the capacity to communicate with those in the communities they've left behind. I'm talking about.
It's so important to stay grounded in the communities that they come from and valuing that lived expertise as much as the education we receive through these institutions themselves.
Absolutely. And so, I like to talk about the fact that knowledge gets produced in many different venues. It's not just the university. And students, in order to be successful intellectuals, have to become aware of the fact that knowledge gets produced elsewhere, and that they need to respect the knowledge that is produced in the community, in the prison, at the workplace, in the labor movement, etc. So I just wanted to make that point.
No, I think that's incredibly important. And that's why I emphasize the importance of students getting involved in local struggles. They might leave their hometown to go to college, but finding out what people in the ground, in the communities where they're living, have been fighting for, how they can help, and cutting their teeth in organizing by supporting folks that might not come from that educational pedigree in what they're fighting for. Because so often we see college towns, the institutions themselves, the universities themselves, have a somewhat predatory relationship with regards to the community at large. And so disrupting that by getting involved in local struggles that help combat some of the exploitations that institutions of higher learning perpetrate on communities at large.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
let's talk about music now.
I'm excited to ask you about music. Yeah, I jumped the gun a little bit. I got super excited. But talk to me about what you see as the connection between social justice and art, music in particular.
I don't think that struggles for social justice can be affected at all without the contributions of artists and musicians. And I was saying before that what is so impressive about the continuities of the Black struggle in this hemisphere, what's so impressive is the fact that so much beauty was produced in the process of engaging in these struggles, and a lot of it was in the form of music. And I, for a long time, I've studied the power of art. My training is in philosophy, and I've had a special interest in aesthetics and the relationship between art and politics, art and social transformation. And I've come to the conclusion that art is the most powerful force when it comes to change. It is artists who allow us oftentimes to feel what we haven't yet learned how to say in the words that we, in our everyday vocabularies. It's artists who can illuminate the path toward the future before we develop the actual descriptions of what it is we think a revolutionized society is going to look like. And in the past, the assumption has always been, perhaps not always, but generally, that when we have movements, we need music and poetry. We need that for relaxation and entertainment. So you organize a rally, and then you have to bring in those who are going to allow you to rest for a moment.
It's so important for sustaining these movements, yeah, and that joy is liberatory. It's an important part of
exactly. As a matter of fact, the ability to experience that collective joy that musicians offer us, give us a sense of what it might be like to live in a liberated society.
Absolutely. I think hip hop particularly is such a powerful form of mass political education about the injustices of mass incarceration, the exploitations of capitalism. we learn through the music of these experiences, and can also use that art for envisioning a world that's different, in addition to the pure joy of experiencing art, for sure.
Absolutely. And I know that you've been very active in using music as it connects to politics and social justice. And you gave us a sense of what you do when, I ask you a question towards the beginning of this conversation. And I was wondering whether you'd be willing to do a short performance now.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a mess so long, we forgot the meaning to cleaning, and only magic could patch it up, so we dream in a genie, by which I mean that we dream into freedom, but freedom is fleeting, by which I mean between seeing people beaten and bleeding on our TVs, on the daily, on the weekly. I just want to relax a bit, crack a paps and watch some videos of cats, and I'm wishing these idiots in Athens would quit with the classism. But I'm really not the great activist, because everyone want to complain about the state of the system, congratulate themselves on Facebook for paying attention, and homie, I know you're right, but if nobody mobilizes the noble fight, we stay enslaved for a century. And I wish simply giving an ish would fix it. I wish giving an ish was as simple as whistling Dixie. The only way to have to fix it is cashing my chips in. So he has to fix the system. First, I have to fix me. So next week is going to beat the rest of them. I'm waking up at 7, stretching and eating vegetables. Could be in my demons, could never be fearsome as feeding them and feeling them beating up on my eardrums.
Oh,
so as we talk about the importance of art and music and bringing that joy that sustains us through organizing and through struggle, I just wanted to, in partial closing, remind folks to care for themselves. I found self-compassion to be so critical for sustaining myself in this work, to seeing every day as a new learning experience and as a dress rehearsal for the challenges to come. So wake up early, stretch, eat your vegetables, drink lots of water. And in closing, I want to ask, if I was your younger self, what would you say to me?
I don't know. I think I would say, keep on doing what you're doing.
All right.
As the elder, I don't think it's my role to call for specific ways of being active, and to tell young people that this is what you need to do. When I was young, I made a lot of mistakes. And now I realize that those mistakes were perhaps even more important than the things I did right, because I learned from them. So I
can agree more.
And I think you have the right to make your mistakes. And we'll all learn from them.
Yeah. Some of my failures are the things I'm most proud of, because even in failing, I learned something or transformed our collective imaginations about what's possible. And so, those mistakes are so necessary. And I embrace them every day, just show gratitude for the learning experiences that life shows me. But Dr. Davis, this has been so lovely. The fulfillment for me of a lifelong dream. So thank you again.
Well, I've been so inspired by listening to you and your music. Is there a way? Do you have anything online or?
Yeah. I perform under the name Lingua Franca.
Okay.
So if you search Lingua Franca, you can find me on YouTube, on Spotify, on Bandcamp.
Absolutely. Wonderful.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you for everyone who tuned in. It's been a joy to speak to you all.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you all.